This is London, one of the most powerful financial capitals on Earth. A city of glass towers, global banks, luxury real estate, and extraordinary wealth. Today it is home to hundreds of thousands of millionaires, dozens of billionaires, and a financial ecosystem that rivals New York and Hong Kong. By almost any metric, London is staggeringly rich. But step outside London, beyond the Thames, beyond the southeast, and the story begins to change. Across large parts of the United Kingdom, disposable incomes lag behind many comparable developed nations. Entire towns that once powered the Industrial Revolution now struggle with stagnant wages, declining industries, and shrinking populations. In some former industrial areas, life expectancy trails behind that of far poorer nations. Regions that built ships, forged steel, and mined coal for an empire now rank among the least productive areas in Western Europe. How did one of history's most dominant economic powers become so geographically unequal? To understand that, we need to go back to 1979, the year Margaret Thatcher entered Downing Street. The crisis before the cure. The 1970s were brutal for Britain. Inflation was spiraling. A pound in 1970 had lost massive purchasing power by the end of the decade. Prices were rising so quickly that households struggled to keep up. Two major oil shocks triggered by actions from OPEC sent energy costs soaring. Fuel, food, transportation, everything became more expensive almost overnight. At the same time, powerful trade unions pushed for higher wages to compensate for rising prices. But higher wages increased business costs, which pushed prices up again. This wage-price spiral became self-reinforcing. Layer on top of that loose monetary policy and heavy government spending, and the result was predictable. Too much money chasing too few goods. By 1979, inflation had become public enemy number one. Thatcher's economic gamble. Thatcher and her chancellor, Geoffrey Howe, embraced a bold and controversial economic doctrine: monetarism. The logic was straightforward. Inflation is caused by excessive growth in the money supply, so to fix inflation, you reduce the growth of money. The government tightened control over sterling M3, aggressively limiting how much money circulated in the economy. Interest rates were pushed to historic highs, climbing as high as 17%. Borrowing became painfully expensive. The goal? Slow spending, cool demand, crush inflation. And in a narrow sense, it worked. Inflation fell dramatically within a few years, but the cost of that victory was immense. High interest rates strengthened the pound, making British exports more expensive abroad. Manufacturers, already struggling, suddenly found themselves uncompetitive. At home, borrowing costs strangled businesses, investment slowed, expansion plans were shelved. Some factories simply shut their doors. Unemployment surged past 2 million. Entire communities dependent on heavy industry entered long-term decline. Even 364 economists publicly criticized the government's approach, arguing it lacked sound theoretical grounding. But Thatcher held firm. To her supporters, this was tough medicine Britain needed. To her critics, it was economic shock therapy, the industrial collapse. Before 1979, manufacturing accounted for nearly 30% of the UK's GDP. By 1990, that share had nearly halved. Industrial employment collapsed. Steel, coal, shipbuilding. Industries that once defined British strength shrank dramatically. But this wasn't just about lost jobs, it was about geography. Britain's industrial base was deeply regional. Northern England, Scotland, and Wales relied heavily on manufacturing and heavy industry. When those sectors contracted, these regions bore the brunt. Meanwhile, London had a different economic structure. It was already transitioning toward services. Finance, law, consulting, media. These industries were less sensitive to high interest rates and benefited from global capital flows. So while unemployment in parts of northern England climbed past 15%, London and the southeast remained comparatively resilient. A new divide was emerging, one that would define Britain for decades: the Big Bang. In 1986, Thatcher's government introduced one of the most transformative financial reforms in British history, the Big Bang deregulation of the City of London. The reforms dismantled old financial rules. Fixed commissions were abolished. foreign ownership restrictions were removed. Electronic trading replaced traditional open outcry systems. London's financial markets were open to the world. The effect was electric. International banks flooded into the city. Capital poured in. High-paying financial jobs multiplied. London rapidly became one of the most dominant global financial centers. On paper, Britain looked rejuvenated. GDP rose. GDP per capita increased significantly throughout the 1980s. But there was a catch: growth without balance. While national income grew, inequality grew faster. The Gini coefficient, a measure of income inequality, rose sharply during this period. Wealth concentrated increasingly in finance-heavy regions, especially London. The shift from manufacturing to services changed not just where jobs were located, but what kind of jobs were available. Manufacturing had supported complex economic ecosystems. A factory didn't just employ workers directly. It supported suppliers, logistics providers, maintenance crews, and surrounding businesses. One direct industrial job often sustained several indirect ones. Financial services, while lucrative, tend to generate fewer indirect jobs per direct position. Income becomes concentrated among a smaller group of highly skilled, highly paid professionals. In short, services can raise GDP rapidly, but they often distribute gains unevenly. For London, the transformation was spectacular. For much of the rest of the UK, it was destabilizing. By the late 1980s, Britain was richer, but more unequal. The economy had been reshaped around finance and the capital city. Industrial towns that once powered the nation were hollowing out. The United Kingdom was no longer economically unified. It was beginning to revolve around a single city. And this was only the beginning. By the early 1990s, the United Kingdom had clearly transformed. The old industrial economy was fading, and a new service-driven model, heavily concentrated in London, had taken its place. Finance, consulting, law, media, and global banking became the engines of national growth. But this transformation created a paradox. If London was booming, why didn't everyone simply move there? Economic theory would predict exactly that. When one region grows wealthier than others, workers migrate toward opportunity. It's a pattern seen across the world, from rural to urban migration in developing countries to internal migration in the United States. And yet, London is different. Despite offering higher median incomes than most parts of the UK, London consistently records negative net domestic migration. In simple terms, more Britons move out of London than move into it. How does that make sense? The answer lies in housing. The right-to-buy revolution. In 1980, Margaret Thatcher introduced one of the most consequential housing policies in modern British history, the right-to-buy scheme. The policy allowed tenants living in council housing, government-owned homes, to purchase their properties at steep discounts. Initially, buyers received discounts of up to 33% for houses and 50% for flats. Later, these discounts increased, in some cases reaching 70%. The political appeal was obvious. It expanded homeownership. It turned tenants into property owners. It aligned with a broader ideological push toward privatization and individual asset ownership. In the short term, it was enormously popular. But there was a structural flaw. The government sold off large quantities of social housing without replacing them at the same rate. Over time, this dramatically reduced the stock of affordable homes, especially in London. In 1980, London had roughly 715,000 council homes, representing close to 30% of the city's housing stock. Today, that number has nearly halved, and social housing makes up only about 10% of London's total housing. At the same time, many former right-to-buy properties eventually entered the private rental market, often at full market rates. The result? A structural shortage of affordable housing in the country's most economically dynamic city. The cost of living reality. On paper, London wages are higher than the UK average. Median household income is roughly 14% higher than the national figure. But once housing costs are factored in, that advantage nearly disappears. Rent in London is roughly double the UK average. Buying property is even more extreme. And it's not just that housing is expensive, it's that space is limited. For the same amount of money, London residents often receive dramatically smaller homes than their counterparts elsewhere in Britain. This changes the migration equation entirely. If you are a top-earning professional in finance, law, or tech, London makes sense. The salary premium outweighs the housing costs. Career advancement opportunities are unmatched. But for middle-income workers, teachers, nurses, retail workers, public servants, the numbers simply don't add up. High wages in London are concentrated in specific industries. For everyone else, real disposable income often barely exceeds, or even falls below, what they could earn elsewhere. So while London generates wealth, it does not offer proportional affordability. The global buyer effect. Housing pressure in London isn't just domestic, it's global. Unlike many cities around the world, London has historically imposed very few restrictions on foreign buyers purchasing residential property. Wealthy individuals from across the globe, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, North America, have treated London real estate as both an investment and a safe haven asset. In some recent quarters, more than a quarter of prime residential property transactions in London involved foreign buyers. This global demand drives prices higher. Now, attracting international capital isn't inherently negative. Foreign investment can stimulate economic activity, but when supply is constrained, due to planning restrictions, limited land, and slow construction, increased demand simply pushes prices up further. Housing becomes an asset class first and shelter second. For local residents competing for homes, this dynamic intensifies affordability challenges. The non-dom incentive. For years, the UK also maintained a favorable non-domiciled tax regime. Individuals who claimed permanent residence abroad could avoid paying UK taxes on certain foreign income and capital gains. This made London particularly attractive to high-net-worth individuals. While these residents did spend money locally, on property, luxury goods, restaurants, services, their presence also amplified housing demand without necessarily expanding productive capacity in other regions. Again, this isn't unique to London. Cities like Sydney, Vancouver, and parts of New York have experienced similar effects. But because London already dominated the UK economy, the housing distortions had nationwide consequences. A city of wealth and homelessness. Perhaps the most striking paradox of London is that extraordinary wealth exists alongside rising homelessness. Rough sleeping has increased over the past decade. Thousands sleep on the streets each year, many more live in temporary accommodation. This juxtaposition, luxury developments next to visible deprivation, reinforces the sense of imbalance. London is wealthy, but that wealth is unevenly distributed. Why people leave? So why do Britons move away from London? Often it's simple economics. Families seek larger homes at affordable prices. Professionals relocate to cities like Manchester, Birmingham, or Bristol for lower living costs. Remote work has further enabled geographic flexibility. London excels at attracting young graduates and global professionals. But as people age, start families, or seek stability, many exit. It becomes a churn machine, constantly pulling in ambitious talent while pushing out those who can no longer justify the cost. The national consequence. The housing crisis doesn't just affect Londoners. It reinforces the national imbalance. Because housing costs deter large-scale migration into London, struggling regions don't fully empty out. But they also don't receive sufficient investment to regenerate independently. The result is a strange equilibrium. London concentrates wealth but limits access through high costs. Other regions lack comparable economic dynamism. The divide persists. And housing is only one dimension. If Britain's geography of opportunity is uneven, its geography of public investment tells an even deeper story. By the 2000s, the shape of Britain's economy was unmistakable. London had become a global powerhouse, a magnet for finance, talent, and capital. Glass towers rose over Canary Wharf. International investors treated Mayfair property like gold bars. The city generated tax revenues that helped fund public services nationwide. But beneath that success, a structural imbalance was hardening. Because the deeper issue wasn't just private wealth. It was public investment. The transport gap. If you want to understand a country's priorities, follow the infrastructure money. Transport spending per person in London has consistently far exceeded that of most other regions in the UK. On a per capita basis, London receives more than double what some northern regions receive for rail, road, and urban transit investment. Projects like the Elizabeth Line dramatically improved connectivity across the capital, reducing travel times, increasing labor mobility, and boosting property values. London's underground, while often criticized, remains one of the densest and most extensive metro systems in the world. Meanwhile, in parts of northern England and the Midlands, rail services are slower, less reliable, and less integrated. East-west connections between northern cities remain weaker than north-south links to London. This matters more than it sounds. Modern economic growth depends heavily on connectivity. The easier it is for workers to commute, businesses to trade, and ideas to circulate, the more productive a city becomes. Economists sometimes refer to this as effective city size. A city isn't just defined by its population. It's defined by how many people can realistically access its labor market within a reasonable commute. London's infrastructure expands its effective size. Many regional cities have far smaller effective sizes than their population numbers suggest. That limits productivity growth. An international comparison. What makes this more striking is that the UK underinvests in transport overall compared to several peer nations. As a share of GDP, Britain has historically spent less on road and rail infrastructure than countries like France and Germany. The result is a national network that struggles to match the efficiency of its European counterparts. But within that limited pot of funding, London has received a disproportionate share. If northern regions had been funded at similar per capita levels, they could have built multiple major transit systems. The cumulative difference over decades amounts to tens of billions of pounds. Infrastructure isn't just about convenience, it's about opportunity. And opportunity has not been evenly distributed. The research and development divide. The imbalance doesn't stop at transport. Research and development, the fuel of long-term innovation, also shows a pronounced geographic skew. Public R&D funding in the UK has been heavily concentrated in higher income, higher productivity regions, particularly London and parts of the southeast. On a per capita basis, government R&D spending in London has often been several times higher than in regions like the Northeast or the Midlands. Now, there is a logic to investing where research ecosystems already exist. Established universities, private sector partnerships, and venture capital networks can amplify public funding. But here's the tension. If public R&D continues flowing disproportionately to already productive areas, it reinforces existing advantages. Regions that need support the most struggle to build the very ecosystems required to attract funding. It becomes a feedback loop. More R&D funding, faster firm growth, more private investment, greater productivity, justification for more R&D funding. Meanwhile, other regions fall further behind. Interestingly, other countries have taken different approaches. In Germany, for example, public research funding has often been directed toward less prosperous regions to strengthen national cohesion and diversify economic activity. The UK model has leaned more toward concentration. The productivity puzzle. One of the most unusual economic facts about the UK is that city size outside London does not correlate as strongly with productivity as it does in many other Western European countries. In France, Germany, or the Netherlands, larger cities tend to be significantly more productive than smaller ones. Scale drives efficiency. In Britain, that relationship is weaker. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds have large populations, but their productivity levels lag behind what their size would predict. Why? Weak transport links, limited regional autonomy, fragmented governance, and lower levels of sustained investment. Without strong intercity rail and integrated planning, northern cities function more as isolated labor markets than as a cohesive mega-region. London, by contrast, operates as a unified economic engine, a self-reinforcing system. By the 2000s, Britain's economy had developed a gravitational center. London attracted global capital. High-income earners clustered there. Tax revenues surged. Infrastructure investment followed. Innovation funding concentrated. Productivity rose further. The rest of the UK was not abandoned, but it was structurally secondary. Government initiatives periodically promised rebalancing. Political leaders spoke of empowering the North, revitalizing industrial towns, or spreading growth more evenly. But altering economic geography is extraordinarily difficult once patterns are entrenched. Capital flows to capital. Talent flows to opportunity. And infrastructure investments, once made, compound over time. The human dimension. All of this translates into lived experience. In London, career pathways in finance, tech, law, and media can lead to six-figure salaries within a decade. In many former industrial towns, median wages have stagnated for years. Young graduates from regional universities often face a choice: relocate to London for better prospects or stay and accept slower advancement. This creates another feedback loop, a brain drain. Ambitious young professionals leave. Local tax bases weaken. Consumer spending slows. Entrepreneurship declines. Not everywhere, of course. Some cities have shown resilience and innovation, but the national pattern remains uneven. The London-centric state. Over time, Britain evolved into something unusual among large developed countries, a highly centralized state dominated by a single metropolitan region. Political power is centralized in Westminster. Financial power is concentrated in the city. Media influence radiates outward from the capital. This centralization amplifies economic centralization. Policies are often designed with London's dynamics in mind. Infrastructure decisions prioritize capital connectivity. Global positioning focuses on maintaining London's competitive edge. And so the divide deepens, not through malice, but through momentum. By the mid-2000s, it was increasingly clear that Britain had not just shifted industries. It had reorganized itself around one city. And that reorganization would soon collide with politics in dramatic ways. By the mid-2000s, the economic divide within the United Kingdom was no longer just an academic observation. It had become political. For decades, London had grown wealthier, more global, more connected. Its skyline symbolized success. International finance thrived. Luxury apartments multiplied. Michelin-starred restaurants flourished along the Thames. But beyond the capital, many communities felt stuck. Wages in numerous former industrial towns had barely recovered from the shocks of the 1980s. Secure manufacturing jobs had been replaced with lower-paid service work. High streets emptied. Young people left in search of opportunity elsewhere. This wasn't simply about income. It was about identity. Communities that once built ships, mined coal, or forged steel had anchored Britain's global power. Their decline felt not just economic, but cultural. And then came 2016, the Brexit divide. In June 2016, the UK voted in a referendum on whether to remain in or leave the European Union. The result? 52% voted to leave. But the geographic split was stark. London voted overwhelmingly to remain. So did Scotland and several major cities. Large parts of England outside the capital, particularly in post-industrial regions, voted strongly to leave. The Brexit vote revealed something deeper than attitude toward Brussels. It exposed a fracture between a globally integrated metropolitan core and a more economically insecure periphery. London had benefited enormously from EU membership. It served as Europe's financial gateway. Free movement supported labor markets. Foreign investment flowed easily. In contrast, many regions that had lost manufacturing capacity saw fewer visible benefits from globalization. For some voters, Brexit was less about trade policy and more about reclaiming control, economically and politically. It was in many ways a reaction to decades of perceived imbalance. The promise of leveling up. In the years following Brexit, successive governments promised to address regional inequality. The phrase leveling up became a central political slogan. The idea was straightforward: spread opportunity and investment beyond London and the southeast. Plans included infrastructure upgrades, relocating certain government departments outside the capital, increased funding for regional development, and empowering metro mayors in cities like Manchester and Birmingham. The ambition was significant, but implementation has been complicated. Major infrastructure projects have faced delays or scaling back. Fiscal constraints limit spending flexibility, and reversing decades of economic concentration is not something that can be achieved in a single parliamentary term. Economic geography evolves slowly. The productivity problem. Overlaying all of this is a broader challenge: the UK's productivity slowdown. Since the global financial crisis of 2008, productivity growth across Britain has been sluggish. This isn't unique to the UK. Many advanced economies have experienced similar slowdowns. But Britain's regional disparities amplify the effect. London remains highly productive by international standards. Outside London, productivity levels fall sharply. This drags down national averages and constrains wage growth. Without sustained improvements in productivity, through skills, infrastructure, innovation, and capital investment, incomes cannot rise meaningfully over time. And without rising incomes, political discontent festers. Can the model change? The United Kingdom still possesses enormous strengths. It has world-class universities. It remains a global financial center. It hosts leading firms in pharmaceuticals, technology, and creative industries. It maintains cultural influence far beyond its size. But the question is whether those strengths can be more evenly distributed. Can cities like Manchester, Leeds, Glasgow, and Birmingham achieve productivity levels comparable to European peers? Can transport links between northern cities create a unified economic zone capable of rivaling London's scale? Can housing policy be restructured to improve affordability without undermining growth? Can R&D investment be directed strategically to nurture regional innovation clusters? These are long-term structural challenges. The London paradox. London itself embodies a paradox. It is both Britain's greatest asset and its greatest imbalance. The capital generates a disproportionate share of tax revenue. It funds public services nationwide. Its global prestige enhances Britain's soft power. Yet its dominance also crowds out. Talent gravitates toward it. Infrastructure funding favors it. Political attention centers on it. And its housing market prices out many of its own workers. London succeeds spectacularly. But in doing so, it highlights the stagnation elsewhere. A crossroads moment. History shows that nations can rebalance. Post-reunification Germany invested heavily in its eastern regions. South Korea developed multiple urban growth centers beyond Seoul. Even within the United States, innovation hubs have expanded beyond traditional coastal strongholds. But such shifts require sustained political will, patient capital, and institutional reform. The UK faces a choice. It can continue relying on London as its primary engine, hoping spillover effects gradually lift the rest of the country. Or it can attempt a more deliberate strategy. Decentralizing power, accelerating regional infrastructure, reforming planning laws, and broadening innovation investment. Neither path is simple. The future of the divided kingdom. The United Kingdom today is not a poor country. It remains one of the world's largest economies. It retains military capability, diplomatic reach, and cultural prestige. But it is uneven. Its wealth is concentrated geographically. Its opportunity is clustered. Its growth is asymmetrical. The factories that once defined its industrial might are largely gone. The empire that once spanned continents has faded into history. In their place stands a service-driven, finance-led economy centered overwhelmingly on one global city. The challenge for Britain is not survival. It is balance. Whether the next decades bring renewed regional dynamism or further centralization will shape not only economic outcomes, but political stability and national identity. London will likely remain powerful. The question is whether the rest of the United Kingdom can rise alongside it. Because a country built on one thriving city and many struggling regions cannot feel whole. And the story of modern Britain is still being written.